Hey students, it's week 27, and this is an economics class. This is Apple Valley High School. I'm Mr. Moore, and I'm excited for you guys to be here and learning about economic reasoning. Over the last few weeks, we've been trying to construct some of the key and core principles that a student needs to understand in order to involve themselves in understanding our economy. We have taken a look at both some microeconomic principles and some macroeconomic principles, and we are attempting to tie those things together and understanding some of the key components and build our vocabulary so we can really dive into this class. The economy affects all of us, rich or poor, um, smart or not. You've got to understand how money works and all the pieces of the puzzle that make an economy healthy. This week, as we talk about economic reasoning, we're asking ourselves questions. This is just one of the questions we might ask, but how much regulation should there be in an economy? Should it be wide open, or should the government get involved? As we look at examples throughout history, we come to the conclusion that if there's absolutely no regulation, there can be some serious disadvantage to certain socioeconomic groups. But as we take these core principles and understand that if the government gets too involved, or if there's a centrally planned economy, then those who are a part of the economic system, regular people, can seriously lose out because there is this intuitive design of competition and the free market and the ability to own property and to regulate our own affairs that creates some of the best systems we've ever seen in the world. So let's dive into it. Each week, I always try to take a little bit of time to give my students some personal, information is from my own experiences in life, economic lessons that I learned. When I graduated from high school, I did not go straight into college. I had some other things that I wanted to do. And so, for honestly, it was like 3 full years after I graduated from high school that I started college. Some people are getting ready to graduate from college. If they take AP classes or concurrent enrollment classes, they could be graduated from college 3 years after high school. But I had other things that I wanted to do, traveling and participating in some service opportunities that I had. So when it came time to get into college, the number one most important thing was I needed money. And so I didn't have a degree, of course, because I was going to college. And having just a high school diploma means that you're kind of stuck with some jobs that are kind of mundane. I worked at a factory building exercise equipment. We built treadmills on an assembly line, and it was good money, but it was hard work, and it was kind of brainless. And as I worked there at a factory while I was going to college, I learned a couple lessons. Number one is don't let the fact that you don't have a lot of money prevent you from going to college. If you're thinking to yourself, well, I'd love to go to college, but I can't afford it, you can. If you work hard and go to school at the same time, you can graduate debt free. It is possible. I proved it's possible. One of the problems that people get when they go to college is they'll take out huge student loans and they get strapped with that for the rest of their lives. There are some political leaders who are pushing to forgive student loans. And if they do forgive student loans, that could cost the taxpayers enormous amounts of money. So we'll see how that goes. We don't know all of the details of it yet, but there are, like I said, there has been some political people asking, and it goes back to this question right here: how much should the government get involved in the economy? If people take out huge student loans, that was a choice they made. Should all of us pay for that? Um, in all of social sciences, it's essential that we function under these three principles. Okay, I'm going to go back for a second just to the title, economic reasoning. So, whatever kind of science class you're in, whether it's biology or chemistry or physiology or human anatomy, or if you're in the social sciences, history, political science, geography, government, economics. We follow the same pattern of coming to conclusions as we observe things, as we pull data, and as we use the scientific method to form hypothesis and then test that hypothesis. When we come up with an answer or we come up with a claim, we have to provide evidence for that claim. And we tie it all together with reasoning. So people will sometimes say claim, evidence, and reasoning. But that reasoning is that logical connection. And so today, as we're talking about economic reasoning, keep that in mind as we make claims and as I provide data and information. I'm going to try my best to show you the reasoning process behind it. But ultimately, as a student in the social sciences, that's something you should be working on as well, developing your ability to make a claim that answers a question, and then making sure that that answer isn't just an opinion. It has to be backed up by data, by evidence. And when you have that evidence, describing it and explaining it and analyzing it is what we're doing here in school, learning to construct formative answers, because quite frankly, nobody cares about what you believe or think unless you can back it up with facts, right? If you can't back up with facts, you can't back it up with logical construction of thoughts, then you're not going to be very influential at all. And that's a huge issue in our world today, is making sure we don't make unsubstantiated claims. Now, let's get into some of the key economic terms. Again, each week I'm trying to just introduce more vocabulary as we try to build our ideas and ultimately try to help you think more like an economist. Remember that when we're studying economics, there's a huge part of like, I kind of like think of it like psychology, and the fact that what we're doing is we're studying why people make certain choices, or maybe not people, but companies, and why are certain trends in certain business cycles true, and why are certain trends true when it comes to why things are produced and how much of things are produced, and how much should the government get involved in the economy, and how much regulation should there be. um, there's not always a clear answer, and so that's why when we make a claim, we try to provide that evidence and tying it together with reason. So here's one of the economic terms that becomes vital as we discuss things economically: tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods to help equalize the cost of items. Um, so, for instance, if the United States produces steel in our country, and we have high end, high grade steel that we produce in our country, what if they could produce steel, and what if it was at the same quality, but they could produce steel in China for half the cost? Where would everybody buy their steel from? It doesn't take too much logic or too much reasoning to realize that if China can produce steel at a cheaper cost and you're getting the same thing, then people will buy all of their steel from China. And thus, steel producers in the United States would suffer. The steel industry would dry up in the United States. Now, there are some other pieces of the puzzle. What if the quality is better in the United States? The cost is higher, but the quality is better. Well, that's a whole different ball game, and now we're dealing with different variables and facts. Um, so what happens is sometimes countries will charge a tax on goods from another country to try to stabilize. So, for instance, if China can produce steel at half the cost, and if we assume that the steel is the same quality as the steel being produced in the United States, then everybody's going to buy their steel from China. But if the United States government slaps a tariff on Chinese imported steel, um, that makes the steel cost the same to the buyer, then it will help preserve steel jobs, and steel companies and steel factories in the United States. The one thought is, though, who's the losers? So who wins? The people who work at the steel factories in the United States get to keep their job because now it doesn't matter if you buy Chinese steel or American steel, it's going to cost the same. The problem is there are losers. We could have got the steel at half the cost from China. So who's the losers in this case? The losers would be the consumers, the people who buy products made from steel, whether that's cars or um, transportation of trucks or bridges that are being produced. Those things are all going to cost more because we've gotten involved now in the economy instead of letting it be an open market kind of policy. Yeah, we might have saved a few jobs for factory workers in the steel industry, but all of us as consumers that use steel products are now going to pay a higher price. If I did my job and you were listening and paying attention, we're going back to that essential question we asked in the beginning. How much regulation should there be in an economy? And tariffs are one example of how governments get involved. Um, and again, there's winners and losers, and it depends on which side of the coin you're on, as if you like those tariffs. Here's another thought: minimum wage. What are the pros and cons of controlling how much people earn? Some people say we have to have a higher minimum wage. It's impossible for me to get an apartment and feed myself and pay for transportation, unless I'm making at least $15 an hour, right? Um, the problem is if we increase minimum wage, um, say I own a restaurant and I'm paying all of my employees $10 an hour. If the law changes and now as the employer I have to pay my employees $15 an hour, well, now I'm going to have to start charging more for my product, right? The food that I sell at my store, I'm going to have to charge more because I'm having to pay my workers more, or else I'm not making as much as the business owner. So sometimes businesses are making enough profit that they can eat a little bit, right? They can pay their workers a little bit more and still be, comfortable and successful. But there's that fine line between, if minimum wage keeps going up, all that's going to do is make everything cost more. And that's a significant problem. Again, there's going to be winners and losers. So people might be making more money, but their purchasing power might decrease. Okay. This is economic reasoning. What we're doing is we're taking principles and we're walking through them logically to try to understand the economic principles, because we're making claims. If you say minimum wage is a bad idea, well, that's a claim, right? Minimum wage is a bad idea. So what's the evidence? Well, then we start going through this evidence and reasoning process, and we can show, look, countries that continually increase their minimum wage, they have higher inflation, right? The cost of things keeps going up and up and up. If you say minimum wage is a great idea, again, you're going to present evidence and tie it together with reasoning to say, look, no matter if cost of items is going up, inflation's always going to happen, whether we increase minimum wage or not. But people literally can't live if the minimum wage isn't at a certain level. And if people aren't able to survive, then government welfare is going to have to kick in. See, we can play both sides, but we're making a claim, we're using evidence, and we're providing that reasoning. Rationing is something that happens. There is a concern about price gouging, but when we have to allocate goods and services using tools other than the price of the commodities. So, for instance, in this last year, people are very familiar with, like, say, a toilet paper crisis, right? For some reason, people went ballistic, overbuying, and stores were running out of toilet paper. So, there's two ways to handle this if you're thinking about it logically. Stores could increase the price of toilet paper so high that people would be like, that's insane. I'm not going to buy toilet paper because it's so freaking expensive. But the fact is, there would be toilet paper on the shelves, and so people could afford to get it. But that doesn't look very good for a company. If a company does that, people start screaming foul. Hey, that's not fair. Just because there's a shortage and you're trying to take advantage of all of us. We all need toilet paper, right? So a lot of companies will keep the price at market value low, just like it was before there was a shortage. But then, of course, the shelves are cleaned out. So rationing is just trying to allocate goods and services, and we try to look for reasons, right? That's the whole point. Economic reasoning. We're looking for reasons. Why did that happen, right? Why was there a toilet paper shortage at the beginning of a pandemic? I mean, when people get scared and nervous, or they feel like their food security is in danger, sometimes, or there's obviously, if the water in the city goes bad, or there's serious damage to the water system, then people will go clean out the shelves of bottled water. Duh, right? Because there's a need for it. But we can't always see the reason unless we dig. Okay. Um, Monopolies are when a market is dominated by a single seller and people don't have any choices. And sometimes governments will step in and become a monopoly. One example is like the DMV. If you want to get a driver's license or register your vehicle, you have to go through the DMV. There's no competition. So some people might even call government entities a monopoly. If you want to register your car, you got to go through the DMV. So they don't have to worry about being nice, or if there's super long lines, or they take forever to do something. It doesn't matter. We as the consumer suffer because there's no competition for them. But they do keep prices at a reasonable level, just because they have to prove that they're not making enormous amounts of money off of us, right? That's got to be that openness in government. So again, monopolies are also like companies that might say there's only one way to get internet in your town. Then that internet provider can charge whatever they want. If you want to get internet, there's only one choice to go through. Nowadays, most places have multiple options. Like in Apple Valley, there's multiple companies. And when there's multiple companies, they compete with each other. And they know that they have reputations. If they provide a good service, people will talk them up. If they don't provide a good service, then they'll lose customers just because their product is crappy. So that competition should bring the price down because they're competing with each other, and quality should be maintained because people have other options, places to go. And so monopolies are bad. And oftentimes the government will step in and say, hey, look, your company's getting too big and it controls too much of the market, and nobody else can really step in. There's been some questions about Google. If Google is too big, if you're going to search something on the internet, is there other options? And Google says, yeah, there's other options. They suck, but that's their problem. We're not stopping anybody from creating a searching platform. But if all the information on the internet is going through one system, Google, that can cause some serious problems. Maybe Google has too much power in that one vicinity. If you look back in the history of the United States, you'll see some examples of monopolies, ranging from like Standard Oil, with John D. Rockefeller controlling all the oil production and distribution, and thus becoming one of the richest people ever. Or if you look at, the steel industry back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s with Carnegie, those are examples of monopolies in the past. But maybe there's some monopolies today that are not as obvious to some of us. But Google is one example. There's not a lot of choice out there when it comes to controlling the flow of information. Um, and there's huge government entities like the European Union who have taken Google to court, and the United States government, takes Google to court and says, hey, maybe this is pushing the lines of being a monopoly. So how much should a government get involved in the economy? You know, um, there's other economic terms where we need to protect um, intellectual property. Should a government get involved, or how much should the government get involved in protecting intellectual property? Trademarks, the movie industry is really famous for this. People will make illegal copies of movies, or the music industry is a big deal in this, right? If you're illegally trading or selling or sharing music files, that means that the artist is losing out on their revenue. And some people are like, well, they're millionaires. Why do we care? You know what I mean? But if we don't protect intellectual rights, if the government doesn't, that can cause serious problems. And people need to feel like their intellectual property is protected by copyrights, by licenses, and by trademarks, right? By patents. Those are things where the government does get involved, and most people believe it's a good idea. Um, Sometimes also the government does get involved with creating a price ceiling, not allowing the price to go over a certain mark. Like, for instance, New York is kind of famous for having like rent control. That way, normal people can still find a place to live. So, even though you might be able to charge a higher rent and people would pay it, the government won't allow you to go over a certain price just to keep it within normal, reasonable bounds. Because sometimes that can cause housing bubbles, and it can also put people out on the street, right? They can't afford to live in certain places. So the government does start to control the cost of things, and also maybe set a price floor. I just saw on the news a couple, like within the last week, and maybe even it's going on still right now in India. There's a lot of farmers who are begging to have a price floor to make sure that their crops, these are farmers in India who say we need to have at least a guarantee of this price. And the government was recently saying, no, we're just going to let the market kind of regulate things. And farmers are like, if you don't guarantee at least a minimum price, that's going to cause problems. We're not going to be able to keep farming. We're going to be, in the poorhouse. So there's price ceilings and price floors. That's the government kind of regulating the price of things. Um, there, of course, are some business terms where we have fixed costs and variable costs that kind of give us the total cost of something, the cost of the raw materials and the stuff that we need to bring in, the cost of what we need to pay to produce our good. And then there's variable costs like rent and electricity and things that fluctuate on a consistent basis. And again, sometimes the government steps in and gets involved and helps regulate some of those things. Hopefully, this gives you a little idea of what I mean when I say economic reasoning. Okay. How has the relative market power and political power of businesses and labor changed? What has been the effort of the change on income distribution over the past 100 years? So, there are sometimes people who own companies who might be more powerful than like the president of the United States. When you get, and I'm just going to throw out some names there, but somebody like Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos, who owns, Amazon, or some of these guys like Bill Gates, who has run Microsoft and since, handed it over, and he's a philanthropist now, but of course, he still owns stock in Microsoft. So there's some of these big names where they might have more power and influence because of their business power. Then there's some people who do both. Somebody like Donald Trump, of course, was a billionaire, successful financially as a businessman, and then stepped into the government role, to kind of shake things up a little bit, and was looking for that powerful change there. So we definitely can see some of that political power and that change back and forth. As far as labor, who's in control? Is it the owners or the workers? The owners are the ones who are investing and taking the risk, so they deserve a bigger reward. Where greater risk is, there's greater reward. And yet the workers are the ones who are doing all of the work. So how has that changed with labor unions and the involvement of the government? Ultimately, when we ask that question, how much should the government regulate, we come back to this idea of capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is an economic system where the means of productions are owned by the private individuals, whereas the means of production, such as money and other forms of capital, are owned by the state or the public, right? It's that communal sense, the greater good. That's socialism, which leads to communism. Some people use those words interchangeably. I don't think they should be used interchangeably, although socialism definitely leans more towards communism. In capitalism, countries live by the profit motive. They exist to make money. All companies have owners and managers. Under a socialist system, everybody works for the wealth that is in turn distributed to everyone. Okay? Under capitalistic ideas, it's the government's job by enforcing laws and regulations to make sure that there is a level playing field, right? And that private run companies. So the job of the government is to make sure that everybody's playing by the rules. If you go into a football game and one team is playing with handguns and the other team is literally playing by the standard rules of football, you would think the guys with handguns are going to win. Uh, that might seem kind of stupid, but that's the idea. If we're not all playing by the same rules, you know, then it's not a fair system, and then we kind of get into that anarchy and chaos. If you went onto a football field with guns and the other team didn't have guns, it's pretty obvious who's going to win. But if everybody is playing by the same rules, hey, these are the rules. This is how you score points. You can't have weapons on the field, but you can hit each other as hard as you want. Oh, okay. Now we're playing by the same rules. And if we're playing by the same rules, then we get a fair competition. At least that's the idea. Under socialism, the government decides how wealth is distributed among the people, and they provide for the people. So the government becomes very powerful, very strong. And that's what centrally planned economies are, these communistic or socialistic systems. In a centrally planned economy, the government owns all the resources and answers those three basic economic questions. What should we produce, and how much should we produce, and for whom we should produce it. Places like the Soviet Union, which has been disbanded in 1991, but there's still some lingering communistic ideas in Eastern Europe. China is the single biggest country population wise on the planet Earth, and of course, they're still a communistic system. But China has realized that one of the problems with a communist system is there's a lack of motivation, and thus the economy doesn't grow. So China has had to have some like capitalistic areas or parts of their country where capitalism can kind of run free. And they've realized that with motivation, people do things. And that's one of the problems with communism is a lack of motivation. If I get an equal slice of the pie without doing anything, why would I do anything? So in general, communist systems are significantly smaller economies. They grow slower. There are some serious problems. If you look at North Korea and their GDP compared to South Korea, it's vastly, significantly different. People are motivated either by carrots or sticks, right? That's a reasoning process. I'm either going to do something because I'm scared of the punishment, stick, or I do something because I want the reward, carrot. Okay? Why do centrally planned economies face problems of poor quality goods, shortages, and unhappy citizens? Um, Poor quality goods because there's no competition. The government's running it all. So there's no motivation to do the work good. If you walked into my class and I said, "Hey guys, everybody's going to pass. Everybody's going to get at least a C," then you wouldn't do anything, right? Because you're already guaranteed a C. Why would you work extra hard to get an A if everybody's going to get a C? Right? And if everybody gets a chance to go to college, doesn't matter what your grades are. Okay. Then why would I even bother to do it? Some people just inherently would, intuitively, but the vast majority of people wouldn't be motivated, right? Well, why am I going to do this assignment? Why am I going to do this work? I'm going to get the same reward anyways. And that's one of the problems. Little incentive to work harder, and central planners have a hard time predicting preferences. What's the best way to deliver services provided by utilities through a public or private but regulated monopoly? So sometimes city governments or even state governments will get involved in utilities, like controlling water distribution or sewage, or controlling like power and electricity. The problem is if anything, whether it's a private entity or the government, if they have too much control, monopoly, and there's no people saying, well, your company sucks, I'm going to go with this other guy. If there is no other guy, that can cause some serious problems, as you might be able to rationally understand. Okay. Advantages and disadvantages of what's good about communism. Well, there's low unemployment. Everybody has a job. And there's great job security because the government is never going to go out of business because it controls everything. And there is equal distribution, right? Nobody's gonna be completely poor. The problem is, though, like things like free healthcare, right? The government, because the government's controlling it all. The problem is there's no incentive to work harder, and there's no incentive to innovate or come up with good ideas because you're still going to get the same slice of the pie. And because there's no competition, quality of goods remain poor, and then you get into corruption and other problems, right? There's few freedoms because the government's controlling everything. This is like a satellite look. I don't know if you can tell what part of the world we're looking at right here, but this is called the Korean Peninsula. Japan would be just off the side over here. Um, this is the lights at night in South Korea. It's a capitalistic system, and it's booming. Its economy is huge. Look at North Korea. Okay, this is China, the world's second biggest economy. Okay, and Korea is a powerful, strong economy. North Korea, a communistic system, and just looking at the GDP, right? North Korea's GDP is 13 billion. You're like, well, that's a lot. Yeah, it is a lot. But look at South Korea's GDP is 1.6 trillion. Okay, how many billion do you need to make a trillion? Right? It's not even close. So sometimes people look at communism and socialism and they think, oh, equality, everybody gets a fair share. That sounds so great. And sometimes people with capitalism, they're like, we're okay with rich and poor because the rich deserve it and the poor, they kind of deserve it too. Now, that doesn't mean that might be overly harsh or simplistic, um, but there are a lot of people who love capitalism who say, I'm happy to help the poor. I just don't want to be forced. I don't want the government to come and take my money. If I have extra, I'll give it to the poor myself, but I want to be in control, right? So it's not like people who believe in capitalism are heartless. Um, okay. What are some of the components of a free economic system then, right? In the abstract, as opposed to a free economy in the real world. So if we like capitalism in the United States, what are some of the components of a free economy that are essential? That private property, that freedom of expression, that right. How easy is it to start a business and to succeed in a business? Those are the kind of things that drive us um, as Americans, right? 55% of Americans think that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's over half. So is capitalism successful? Or or should the government step in a little bit? Not that we should destroy capitalism, but maybe there should be some regulation because maybe the rich are getting richer. Money makes money. And if you're not in that system, if you're in the poor class, it's hard to break out of that. And the more there's a divide in our society, the more violence and problems we have. 65% uh, think most big businesses have dodged taxes and bought favors, and they're polluting our environment. So some people think, man, I'm a regular guy and I'm working hard, and my tax dollars, I can't escape that because I don't have the money to hide it. And some of these companies really do hide money in offshore accounts. So they do dodge the bullet and don't pay their fair share, right? Um, so it's interesting, you know what I mean? Um, how do we feel about capitalism? Okay. Here's some of the reasons why communism failed. Okay. Remember, if I make a claim, I have to provide evidence and I have to provide the reasoning so that this makes sense, or else you won't believe what I say. So, example of why communism failed: if consumers want smartphones and only one company is making them, other companies cannot start making phones, and there's no competition, which means the company, if there's only one company making smartphones, they can charge whatever they want, right? And if the quality sucks, too bad. There's no other choice out there. There's no variety. More phones will not be made until the government decides, right, to create new factories. The end result is there's a shortage of goods that consumers want, produced at the highest price and the lowest quality. That's why we're not in favor of communism, okay? The United States is the strongest economy in the world, and sometimes it's hard for people to realize how much bigger our economy is than other countries until you look at it like this. If you don't understand what you're looking at, these are the states, the economies of the states compared to the economy of other countries. Great Britain is the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world. Of course, economies go up and down, okay? So when I'm recording this, if you go Google it, a list of the strongest economy or biggest economies in the world by GDP, you get the United States at the top, China second, Japan third. When we get into like the fourth, usually is Germany. Fifth and sixth kind of go back and forth between France and Great Britain, and it depends on which data you're looking at. But Great Britain and France, neck and neck. California alone by itself could compete with Great Britain or France. Not both, but one or the other. Look at this right here. The second biggest country on the planet Earth, land size, is Canada. And Texas makes about as much money per year as Canada does. And the country below us, right, to the south, Mexico, the state of Florida makes about as much money per year as Mexico. So if you start thinking about that and you're wondering why immigration, right? Why people want to come to the United States, that's because this is where the money is, right? This is where the money is. So just keep those things in mind, where you live and your view of the economy. In order to really be a student in this class, you need to know some geography. And so during both my government class first semester and my economics class second semester, I require students to learn some geography. And so on the final test, there is going to be 25 key countries around the world. So I highly recommend in your notes that you write these down and you start to memorize them. I have chosen them for different reasons, and I'm going to go over them right now. The biggest economy on the planet Earth is the United States. It's the strongest economy in the world. And of course, that means it's the strongest economy in North America. It's substantially bigger. As I just pointed out, Florida alone makes as much money, GDP. Its economy is as big as Mexico. And Texas by itself, its economy is as big as Canada. And California, okay, its economy is as big as Great Britain. So Canada is a very successful country. Economically, it's nice in Canada. Remember that the population of California is bigger than Canada. So even though they're not making as much money as the United States, there's a lot less people. And so that's the other thing we kind of have to keep in mind when it comes to economic understanding. It's not just how big the economy is, it's how much we're dividing it amongst the population, if that makes sense. So number one is the United States, and number two is Canada, and number three is Mexico. And those, of course, are the dominant countries in North America. Number four, I picked Haiti. And the reason I picked Haiti is because it's the worst economy in North America. It's not the worst economy in the world, although it's pretty dang bad. But Haiti is one spot in North America that is just a low point. Its economy is horrific and crumbling and terrible. So I kind of wanted to point that out as an example of a horrible economy in North America. Number 5 is Costa Rica. It's kind of known as the Switzerland of Central America because it's economically strong. It has no standing army. It's big on tourism. It's a safe place to travel to. And economically, it's pretty dang nice. Now, if you go to Costa Rica, you might say, well, this kind of still seems like a third world country. It's not. It's not a strong economy like, say, the United States, but for its neighborhood, right, where it's at in North America, it is quite strong. Okay, economically. So again, it's all about perspective. If you cross over the border into Nicaragua, you see the difference. You're like, wow, Nicaragua is really economically poor. So compared to its neighbors, Costa Rica isn't a good place. Okay. Obviously, number 6 is the biggest country in South America, Brazil. And economically, it's a powerhouse in South America. It's got the biggest population, biggest land size, and biggest economy in South America. I put number 7 in right here in Peru, and I think that's a really important. It's a very large country, and it's in its contrast to some of its neighbors. Okay, number 8 right here is Argentina. Economically, it has done well, although in the last few years it's had some economic recessions, and that can cause some serious problems as well. Now, jumping across over to here, these 4 countries in Europe are in the top 10. All 4 of these countries are in the top 10 biggest economies of the world. Um, Number 9 is France. It's in the top 10. Number 10 is Great Britain. It's again in the top 10 biggest economies in the world. Number 11, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. And number 12 is Italy. And again, it usually finds itself in the top 10 biggest economies of the planet Earth. Okay. Number 13, 14, and 15 are in the news all the time. Again, I want you to learn all of the countries on the planet Earth. Like, part of me was debating between Venezuela, right? I'm like, oh, they should know where Venezuela is. That's a horrible economy, you know. But again, there's only a certain number of I didn't want. I would love for you to learn all the countries of the world, but I thought 25 is a good place to go to. The reason I put Syria and Iraq and Iran is because of how often they're in the news. Syria's economy has been destroyed by civil war. Iraq, we've invaded Iraq twice. The United States Army has twice in my lifetime. Okay, so with some serious political problems, and so of course that affects the economy. I put number 15 on there right now because the United States and other European countries have put economic sanctions on Iran to try to discourage them from producing nuclear weapons and have a nuclear program. And so their economy is superficially hurt by economic sanctions from the United States. That means that we're punishing them, trying to get them to do certain things for us. Um, Number 16 is Nigeria. It's the biggest population in Africa. So it's one of the bigger economies, but probably financially the most successful economically in Africa is South Africa. Unfortunately, Africa has some of the worst economies in the world as we get into what we call sub-Saharan Africa, these countries that were diced up by Europeans back in the 1800s. And there's been substantial civil war and genocide and huge issues, really because of that imperialism. India is probably one of the most important countries in the world because it's the second biggest population. It will probably overtake China in the near future. So economically, it is strong and it's increasing. That's the key right there. It's growing bigger. Okay. So it's a huge economy, but it also has a huge population. So there's still a lot of poverty. Even though it's a huge economy, the size of its population means they're spreading out the wealth thinner, if that makes sense. Australia is a haven. It's nice. It's got a low population and tons of resources. If you went to Australia, I've been to Australia, it kind of feels a lot like the United States. Okay, have a very capitalistic, open society. It feels a lot like the United States in a good way, in that regards. Vietnam, I put on here because it was a communist country. It still technically is, but they've been employing a lot more capitalism and allowing outside investment. And so its economy has been growing substantially lately. And I thought I'd put that one on there as an example of an economy that's really been booming lately. You'll see the more they open up and have that motivation to make money, society will increase, life expectancy will increase, more tourism will happen, people will feel safer there. So Vietnam's on the rise. With number 21, we're talking about Japan, third biggest economy in the world. I already talked about the vast difference between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea being communist and a horrible economy. Uh, 22 is South Korea and it's booming, right? We already showed you that picture there. Of course, China is the world's second biggest economy, but biggest population. So there is still some poverty there. But they're going to probably see. My prediction is they're going to surpass the United States as the world's biggest economy, and I think they should because they have more people there, right? So, if they're going to have a decent chance at a decent life, their economy should be bigger than the United States. And of course, Russia, the world's biggest country, but not the biggest economy. And that's always been a significant issue with Russia. Maybe one of the reasons why they lost the Cold War. So those are the countries that will be on the test. And so hopefully you've taken the time to learn those countries and that should be effective. The truth is, I might go back and change this to Venezuela now that I think about it, because that would be a good example of a country that's really suffering with problems. So I'll probably do that later on. It's different. I choose different countries just because of things that are going on in the news. But overall, that's what's going to be on the test. I'll give you a study guide in class to help you out. So learning goal number 9 this week, students will understand that competition among sellers lowers the costs and prices and encourages producers to produce more of what consumers are willing and able to buy. Competition among buyers increases prices, allocates goods and services to those who are willing and able to pay the most for them. Okay? So these are the things. There are some review videos that will go over some of the topics that we've discussed and kind of help you learn some of these economic principles. Thank you for joining me on week 27, economic reasoning. Next week, there will be no notes because during week 28, we'll be taking a third quarter final. So there's not going to be any new information, but I'm going to test you on the concepts we've just learned. Thanks for being here. We'll talk to you soon.